outrageously tough snore. Sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time for the especial purpose of holding a conference with the second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention. But, finding that he turned uncomfortably cold when he began to wonder which of his curtains this new spectre would draw back, he put them every one aside with his own hands, and lying down again, established a sharp lookout all round the bed. For he wished to challenge the spirit on the moment of its appearance, and did not wish to be taken by surprise and made nervous. Gentlemen of the free and easy sort, who plume themselves on being acquainted with a move or two, and being unusually equal to the time of day, express the wide range of their capacity for adventure by observing that they are good for anything, from pitch and toss to manslaughter, between which opposite extremes no doubt there lies a tolerably wide and comprehensive range of subjects. Without venturing for Scrooge quite as heartily as this, I don't mind calling on you to believe that he was as ready and for a good broad field of strange appearances, and that nothing between a baby and an elephant would have astonished him very much. Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently, when the bell struck 1 and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, quarter of an hour went by, yet nothing came. All this time he lay on his bed, the very core and center of a blaze of ruddy light which streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour, and which, being only light, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, as he was powerless to make out what it meant, or would be at, and was sometimes apprehensive that he might be at that very moment a interesting case of spontaneous combustion without having the consolation of knowing it. At last, however, he began to think as you or I would have thought at first, for it is always the person not in the predicament who knows what ought to have been done in it, and would unquestionably have done it too. At last, I say, he began to think that the source and secret of this ghostly light might be in the adjoining room, from whence, on further tracing, it seemed to shine. This idea taking full possession in his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by name and bade him enter. He obeyed. It was his own room, there was no doubt about that, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove, from every part of which bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there, and a mighty blaze went roaring up in the chimney as that dull petrification of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, for many a winter season gone. Heaped upon the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12 cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in a shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it high up to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door.
"Come in,"
exclaimed the ghost.
"Come in and know me better, man." Scrooge entered timidly.
Scrooge entered timidly. He hung his head before the spirit. He was not the dogged Scrooge he had been, although the spirit's eyes were clear and kind. He did not like to meet them.
"I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me."
Scrooge reverently did so, and was clothed in one simple green robe, or mantle, bordered with white fur. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capricious best was bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by artifice. Its feet were observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face, its sparkling eye, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanor, its joyful air. Girded round its middle was an ancient scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust.
You have never seen the like of me before,
Exclaimed the spirit. Never, Scrooge made to answer.
having never walked forth with younger members of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my elder brothers born in these later years,
Pursued the phantom. Well, I don't think I have, said Scrooge. I am afraid I have not. Have you many brothers, spirit?
more than 1,800.
A tremendous family to provide for, muttered Scrooge. The ghost of Christmas present rose. Spirit, said Scrooge submissively, conduct me where you will. I went forth last night, on compulsion, and I learnt a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit from it.
Touch my robe.
Scrooge did as he was told, and it held fast. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivies, turkey, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat, pigs, sausages, oysters, pies, pudding, fruit, and punch all vanished instantly. So did the room, and the fire, and the ruddy glow, and the hour night, and they stood in the city streets of Christmas morning, where, for the weather was severe, the people made a rough but brisk and not unpleasant kind of music, in scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings, and from the tops of their houses, whence it was a mad delight to see the boys come plumping into the road down below and splitting into artificial little snowstorms. The house fronts looked black enough, with the windows blacker, contrasting with the smooth white sheet of snow upon the roof, and with the dirtier snow upon the ground, which last deposit had been ploughed up in deep furrows by the heavy wheels of carts and wagons, furrows that crossed and recrossed each other hundreds of times, where the great streets branched off and made intricate channels, hard to trace in the thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choked up with a dingy mist, half thawed, half frozen, whose heavier particles descended in a shower of sooty atoms, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had, by one consent, caught fire, and were blazing away in their dear hearts' content. There was nothing cheerful in the climate or the town, yet there was an air of cheerfulness abroad that the clearest summer air and brightest summer sun might have endeavored to diffuse in vain. For the people who were shoveling away on the housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets, and now and then exchanging a facetious snowball, better-natured missile than many a wordy jest, laughing heartily as it went right, and not less heartily if it went wrong. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiterers were radiant in their glory. There were great, round, pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts, shaped like the waistcoats of jolly old gentlemen, lolling at the doors, and tumbling out into the streets in their apoplectic opulence. There were ruddy brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish onions, shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars, and winking from their shelves in wanton slyness as the girls went by and glanced demurely at the hung-up mistletoe. There were pears and apples clustered high in blooming pyramids. There were bunches of grapes made in the shopkeeper's benevolence to dang from conspicuous hooks that people's mouths might water gratis as they passed. There were piles of filberts, mossy and brown, recalling their fragrance ancient walks through the woods and pleasant shufflings ankle-deep through withered leaves. There were Norfolk biffins, squat and swarthy, setting off in the yellow of the oranges and lemons, and in great compactness of their Jersey persons, urgently entreating and beseeching to be carried home in paper bags and eaten after dinner. The very gold and silver fish set forth among these choice fruits in a bowl, though members of a dull and stagnant-blooded race, appeared to know that there was something going on, and to a fish went gasping round and round their little world in a slow, passionless excitement. The grocers, the grocers, nearly closed with perhaps 2 shutters down, or 1, but through those gaps such glimpses as it was not as the scales descending on the counter made a merry sound, or that the twine and roller parted company so briskly that the canisters were rattled up and down like juggling tricks, or that even the blended secrets of tea and coffee were so grateful to the nose that even the raisins were so plentiful and rare, that the almonds so extremely white, and the sticks of cinnamon so long and straight, the other spices so delicious, the candied fruit so caked and spotted with molten sugars to make the coldest lookers-on feel faint and subsequently bilious. Nor was it that the figs were moist and plumpy, or that the French plums brushed in modest tartness from their high-decorated boxes, that everything was good to eat, and in its Christmas dress. The customers were also hurried and eager in the hopeful promise of the day that they tumbled up against each other at the door, crashing their wicker baskets wildly, and left their purchases upon the counter, came running back to fetch them, and committed hundreds of the like mistakes in the best humor possible. While the grocer and his people were so frank and fresh that the polished hearts which they fastened their aprons behind might have been their own, worn outside for general inspection, and for Christmas daws to peek at if they chose. But soon the steeples called good people, and to church and chapel away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes, with their gayest faces, and at the same time there emerged from scores of by-streets, lanes, and nameless turnings innumerable people, carrying their dinners to bakers' shops, and the sight of these poor revelers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he stood with Scrooge behind him in a baker's doorway, and taking off the covers as the bearers passed, sprinkling incense on their dinners from his torch. It was a very uncommon kind of torch, for once or twice there were angry words between some dinner carriers who had jostled each other. He shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humor was restored directly. For they said it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day, and so it was. God love it, so it was. In time the bells ceased, and the bakers were shut up, and yet there was a genial shadowing forth for all these dinners and the progress of their cooking in the thawed blotch of the wet above each baker's oven, where the pavement smoked as if stones were cooking too. Is there a peculiar faint flavor in what you sprinkle from your torch?
There is. My own.
Would it apply to any kind of dinner this day? Asked Scrooge.
To any kindly given. To a poor one most.
Why to a poor one most? Asked Scrooge.
Because it needs it most.
Spirit, said Scrooge after a moment's thought, I wonder, of all the beings in this world about us, should desire to cramp all the people's opportunities of innocent enjoyment. You would deprive them of their means of dining every seventh day, often the only day on which they can be said to dine at all, said Scrooge. Wouldn't you?
I,
cried the spirit. You seek to close these places on the seventh day, said Scrooge, and it comes to the same thing.
I seek,
exclaimed the spirit. Forgive me that I am wrong. It has been done in your name, at least that in your family, said Scrooge.
There are some upon this earth of yours who lay claim to know us, and who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are as strange to us and to all of our kith and kin as if they had never lived. Remember that, and charge their doings upon themselves, not us.
Scrooge promised that he would, and they went on, invisible, as they had before, into the suburbs of the town. It was remarkable quality of the ghost which Scrooge had observed at the baker's, that notwithstanding his giant size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, that he stood below a low roof quite as gracefully as he, like a supernatural creature, as it was possible he could have done in a lofty hall. Perhaps it was the pleasure the good spirit had in showing off this power of his, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature, as his sympathy with all poor men, that led him straight to Scrooge's clerk. For there he went, and took Scrooge with him, holding onto his robe, and the threshold of the spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinkling of his torch. Think of that! Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his four-roomed house. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for sixpence, where she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, and also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property conferred upon his son in honor of their day, into his mouth, and rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks. And now two smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's had smelt the goose, and known for their own that, basking in the luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table and exulted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud, although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes bubbling up knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. What has ever got your precious father, then? Said Mrs. Cratchit. And your brother, Tiny Tim. And Martha wasn't late last Christmas by half an hour. Here's Martha, mother, said the girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha, Mother!" cried the two young Cratchits. "Hurrah! There's such a goose, Martha!" "Oh, why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are," said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet with her officious zeal. "We'd a great deal of work to finish up last night," replied the girl. "I had to clear away this morning, Mother." "Well, never mind, so long as you are come," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Sit you down by the fire and have a warm, Lord bless you." "No, no, there's Father coming!" cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide!" So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob and the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter exclusive to the fringe hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and his limbs supported by an iron frame. "Oh, why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking round. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming?" said Bob, with a sudden clenching in his high spirits. For he'd been Tim's blood horse all the way from church, and had come home rampant. "Not coming upon Christmas Day." Well, Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, so it were only a joke. She came out prematurely from behind the closet door, ran into his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash house that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did little Tim behave?" said Mrs. Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob on his credulity, and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold, and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, he thinks the strangest things you've ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped that people saw him in the church, because he was a cripple, it might pleasant them to remember upon Christmas Day, who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active left crutch was heard on the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire, and while Bob, turning up his cuffs as if, poor fellow, there was some capable of being more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, in which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose with the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon to which a black swan was a matter of course, and in truth it was very something like in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy, ready beforehand in a little saucepan, and hissing hot, Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce, and Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner, and the two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves in mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons into their mouth, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set upon, and the grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it into the breast, and when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose around the board. Even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" Well, there was never such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there was such a goose, cooked in tenderness and flavor and size and cheapness, with themes of universal admiration, eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes. It was a sufficient dinner for the whole family, indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish. They hadn't ate it all at last. Yet everyone had had enough. And the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. By now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have gotten over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose, a supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horror was supposed. A great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like washing day. Oh, that was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door with each other, with a laundress next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly with the pudding. It's like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half of a quart, and then ignited brandy and bedlight with Christmas holly struck into the top. Oh, a wonderful pudding. Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said now the weight was off her mind, and would confess that she had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it. Nobody would say they thought it was too small a pudding for a larger family, or it would have been a flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed at the hint of such a thing. At last the dinner was all done, and the cloth was cleared, and the hearth swept, and the fire was made. The compound and the jug being tasted and considerably perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning a half a one. And at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug. However, as the golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily, then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears, God bless us," which all the family echoed. "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side, in his little stool. Bob held his withered hand in his, and as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, dreaded he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live."
I see a vacant seat in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die.
No, said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit, say he will be spared."
If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, if none other of my race find him here, what then? If he be like to die, had he better do it, and decrease the surplus population.
Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief.
"Man," said the ghost, "if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is, and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live and what men shall die? It may be that in sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Oh God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing the too much life among his hungry brothers in death."
Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling, his eyes cast upon the ground. But he raised them speedily upon hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob. "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "Founder of the feast, indeed," cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon. I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "Oh, my dear," said Bob. "The children! Christmas Day!" "It should be Christmas Day, I am sure, on one which drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfailing man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert, and nobody knows it better than you, poor fellow. Oh, my dear, Christmas Day. I'll drink his health for your sake and the day's, not for his. Long life to him. Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her, and it was the first of their proceedings of which had no heartiness. Tiny Tim drank the last of it all, but he didn't care 2 pence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, there were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of the Scrooge the Baleful being done with. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6 pence weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremulously at the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from in between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investment he should favor when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told them of what kind of work she had to do, and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest. Tomorrow being a holiday, she passed at home. Also, she had seen the Countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was as much about as tall as Peter, and at which Peter pulled up his collar so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All this time the chestnuts in the jug went round, and by they had a song about which a lost child travelling in the snow, from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof, and their clothes were scanty. Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time when they faded and looked happier in the bright sprinklings of the spirit's torch at parting. Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially upon Tiny Tim, until the last. I'll see you for part 2.